a commission on election integrity. And it began in May of 2017. And it included some people that you might be familiar with. But the job was to identify the vulnerabilities in voting system that could lead to voter fraud. Here's a couple of names you might be familiar with. Before he was the czar of COVID-19, he chaired this committee on the Commission on Election Integrity, Mr. Pence. His sidekick, you may be familiar with his name, Chris Kobach. He was unsuccessful in running for or in being elected to the governorship of Kansas. Recently, he lost the primary to be the senator from Kansas, Chris Kobach. So that duo led the commission. Were they successful? Well, the effort lasted less than 1 year. The commission was dissolved. So the question you have to ask is, why did it dissolve in such a short time? Maybe the answer is obvious, because they could not find sizable fraud. In fact, we have information. And here in this review, you're talking about 31 times where fraud was committed since 2014 out of 1 billion ballots cast. More numbers. 30 incidents and 23.5 million votes tabulated. This is from the Brennan Center, a think tank. Now, one of the charges on the part of the president and the right is that votes are harvested. If you're not familiar with the term, harvested means that you can volunteer to go to a senior senator and pick up ballots and make sure they are delivered. Now, in some states are stricter than that. You have to be a relative. And that is one place where voter suppression has actually gone backwards. They become more lenient. And they have found that there really is no large history of that kind of malfeasance or fraud, voter harvesting. So who's in charge for regulating the election? Well, first of all, we got to know that you need money in order to win elections. Here's a big number, $1.1 billion. But this is taking us back 20 years ago. Look at the jump in 6 short years. In the last presidential election, over $6 billion was the price tag. Now, we're only talking about the race for the presidency. We're not talking about the ballot for Congress. Here's the projection, $10 billion. Now, you might say to yourself, how can we still increase this number when we're talking about less campaign stops? You're not jetting across the country as you have done in the past because of COVID. Well, what's happening is that the candidates recognize this and they are putting more monies into ads. But this might be a surprise to you. Who's actually footing the bill? Well, not 90% of us. We're not doing it. We've never donated to the election campaign. And of that number, we probably gave less than $200 because only 0.5% gave more than $200 to candidates in 2008, for example. So it's a very select few people that are coming up with that $10 billion. In specific, you may have heard about the $100 million commitment that Bloomberg is making in Florida. Now, if you are on the left, you probably celebrate that fact. But if you're on the right, you're a little upset about that, because think of how you would feel if the Koch brothers, for example, were to commit that amount in Florida on behalf of Trump. So all this money being spent left and right, who's responsible for regulating these amounts? The Federal Election Commission. We've already identified them in part one, but I want to point out some mechanics to the FEC. First of all, there is no chief. It's a board. It's an even number. And I know you're probably thinking, well, that's a bad idea to begin with, because it is an even number of commissioners on the board. There is some form of fairness, because we're talking about 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans. He is careful, the president, to appoint people from opposing sides. And in order for anything to happen, any judgment to occur, you need the majority to vote. You need 4 affirmative votes. But there is a problem. First of all, it's been over 2 months that we have had a quorum. We have not had enough people in order to conduct business. These are the number of cases that are on the docket waiting for some sort of action. It's not occurring because there is no quorum. And on 68 of those 300 cases, we can no longer get a decision because the statute of limitations has expired. More numbers for you. Haven't been able to get on track for a while. In 2019, there were 8 regularly scheduled meetings, could not have them. The Inspector General, the person who overlooks the FEC, has tried to get the message across that something has to be done. Now, there are 3 people. Remember, you need 4 in order to get a decision. There are 3 people still left on the FEC. Their terms have expired, but there has been no one to replace them. Now, remember, these are the people that are supposed to oversee the spending on campaigns. All right, so you're going to say, let's take care of business. Is there an idea that had been put forth to take care of this problem? Yes, there is reform on the wings. It's called HR 1. If you know anything about Congress numbers their bills in the order in which they are put forth in every session. So this was the first bill in this last session, HR number 1, House of Representatives number 1. So you can see it's top priority. Here's the idea. Instead of an even number, let's have an uneven number. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans, 1 independent. And there is going to be a chair appointed by the president. You cannot stay beyond a term. Remember, there are people that are still staying on after their term has expired. Now, they've also made it so that these commissioners don't have to deal with frivolous cases. This is HR 1. It's passed in the House, stalled in the Senate. But there is a resolution for the FEC to become, once again, a working body. So there's hope in the future. Now, maybe this is a good time, because I ran right into business, to remind you that this is part 2 of the overview of election 2020. My name is Ed Cabrera. We hopefully have addressed the technical problems that we had in the first presentation. I have some able help today. I have an engineer, Bob, is helping me today. Hopefully all those problems that occurred in the first presentation will not be with us today. We're talking next about fundraising alternatives and limitations. Now, as you know, there are a cavalcade of ways for people to raise monies. The candidates can raise money through, well, direct solicitation. Today, in the year 2020, most transactions occur online. We also can have dinners which run up to $50,000 a plate. You can pay just to have a selfie with a candidate. Of course, monies are raised and rallies, but not as much as in the past because of COVID. and any manner of merchandise. So money comes rolling into the campaigns. But there are limits to what individuals can give to these campaigns. First of all, $2,800. But mind you, that's per election. So here in San Luis Obispo, you'd give $2,800 to your candidate for the House, candidate for the Senate. You can give money to either Senate campaign if there's two per year, but there usually is not. Of course, to the president, and you can send your money outside of state as well. We're going to be discussing political action committees, PACs. You are limited to $5,000 there per PAC, and there are numerous PACs you could spend until you emptied out your treasury. And you can give money to your committees, not only your state committee, but also your district and local party committee. And of course, you can give money to your national committee. So there's a limit, it's true, but to the average citizen, it's far above what we would be spending. So interest groups have organized in order to augment the spending by the individuals. Because remember, we're only talking about a very small number of people who donate to campaigns. Now, you've got similar goals, you got similar backgrounds, you want to influence legislation, then you would form an interest group. Here are examples of interest groups. And if you develop a negative attitude toward interest groups, let's say, for example, you are on the left and you consider the NRA as the evil interest group, that remember that there are interest groups that would support you, like Common Cause. And if you are on the right, you probably are not very happy with some of the stances that the ARP is taken of late. So what happened is that the direct impact has been affected that interest rates can have on elections. Because if you reform parties and you reform individuals, you give more power to the interest groups. A famous Supreme Court decision, Buckley-Vallejo, in the 1970s, addressed this spending, which they felt was getting out of hand. And it said you can put limits on individual and corporate contributions because they don't violate freedom of speech. Now, people complain about the courts sometimes that they contradict their findings, and the rulings 20 years after a previous ruling are so much different, but things change, things evolve. But they said, hey, if you're Mitt Romney and you want to spend your money on your own campaign, then any limit is a violation of Mitt Romney's First Amendment. Because we're really not talking about across-the-board violation of First Amendment rights. We're talking about an individual's. So if Mitt Romney wants to do that, he has the right to do that. But I do want to remind you that if you hear of Mitt Romney giving $100 million to his own campaign, Bloomberg, he blew $1 billion, or if Trump wants to lend his campaign $100 million, please do remind that eventually they are repaid by their campaign, more likely than not. Buckley did identify 8 magic words. First of all, on your ad, if you don't want a limit on the funds that you can spend, you should not have on your ad, vote for. You should not have words elect, support, cast your ballot for. You should not identify yourself in the ad if you are running, and you may not advocate a vote against your opponent. Those are the type of words that you may not use. As long as you avoid those words, then we get into another category, which I'm going to discuss in a few minutes. Then there can be no limits as long as you eliminate those words, because then you are not direct campaigning. Any variations thereof. These are the 8 magic words that Buckley pointed out you could not use. Along came a bipartisan. Wow. Don't use that word much anymore. Bipartisan, which means McCain, Senator McCain, a Republican, and Senator Feingold, a Democrat, came together for bipartisan legislation because their concern was limiting spending, also known as the BCRA. And this was in 2002. They wanted to get rid of soft money in federal campaigns. What is soft money? Well, getting back to the last slide, if you avoided those words and you said, we want to bring back decency in America, and you had a 1-minute ad, but you never said elect, do not vote for, you never use your candidate's name, oh, but just by coincidence, your candidate comes up, then that would be referred to as soft money because you are not directly campaigning, it's indirect. But McCain and Feingold saw a problem with that. They wanted to ban soft money. They wanted to get rid of that practice in federal campaigns. This did not affect state and local campaigns. It also went after foreign contributions because at this time it was identified that foreign countries were putting money into the campaigns. But individuals and groups could give more as a result of this legislation. Now, what happened is all of a sudden there was a huge shift because, yes, this manacled the political parties themselves, but it kind of opened the door wide for third-party groups, which of course brought us to the Citizens United decision. And Justice Kennedy wrote that it is a violation of the First Amendment rights if you limit independent political spending. It's not a threat, said the court. Providing if you're part of this group, if you're part of this PAC, that you don't work directly with the campaign. If you work independently, there is no limit. Now, there is the key. There is the key. And there have to be people overlooking this in order for this to work. So again, soft money versus hard money. If you are directly supporting someone and you use those 8 words, you make it there's no question of who you are supporting. That's direct electioneering, and that uses hard money. Soft money, it gets a little more nebulous. So if you're doing bumper stickers, for example, if you're saying make America great, well, everyone knows what you're talking about, but it really doesn't directly refer to a candidate. You could, by the way the rules are written, consider that soft money. So we mentioned the PACs before. What is a political action committee? Well, they raise money. They raise money, they're trying to influence candidates, and they're trying to get their goals accomplished. Any number of different types of PACs. Here's 2 examples. You could work for yourself, elect Mitch McConnell, or if it's a group, elect Senators for the American Way, which is Mitch McConnell and those people who support him. So you'll see that the numbers start to rise when it comes to political action committees, but you cannot accept union or corporate treasury funds according to that legislation. And you have to report the monies which you raise. Now that of course means that you're gonna have to go a step farther. You're gonna have to go to a super cap or a super PAC, which has very little limits. In fact, it's unlimited on the part of corporations and unions. Again, you cannot give directly to a candidate. But if you are, for example, the Sierra Club, you can advocate for a cleaner environment without mentioning the candidate, but everyone knows who you're talking about. And you have to make all your spending and all your fundraising public, and you have to report it to the FEC. Now, there are many ways around it. You've probably heard of 501Cs. That refers to a clause in the IRS laws. And if you have a 501C organization, then you can give money without having to report it. And it's got a name attached to it, which is misleading to some people. It's called dark money. And if you're talking about the dark side of the net or something like that, it has very evil, negative connotations. And all that simply means is you do not have to tell people who are the people that are giving money to your organization. And if you have a candidate and you advocate for the candidate, it cannot make up the majority amount of business that your organization conducts. And you give money to the super PAC, not directly to a candidate. Here are examples of 501Cs. Now, who thinks of your local Little League as a evil organization? But they don't have to disclose who gives money to support the local Little League. Of course, if you're Bill and Melinda Gates, everyone knows who's supporting that organization, but that is also another 501c organization. Not to be confused with 527s. They're also tax exempt, but they also cannot advocate for a specific candidate. They don't get involved in dark money. They have to identify the contributors. But anybody our age knows the way the game is played, is that the election is going to be November 3rd, and more often than not, those contributors will not be identified until after the election. So for all intents and purposes, you really don't know who's funding a campaign often. Here's an example of 527s. The most notorious one in our recent memory was in the election of John Kerry, or the non-election of John Kerry, where he was blasted by the Swift Boat Veterans for Truth. They never did come out and say vote for Bush. They were exposing Kerry's alleged behavior in Vietnam, and a lot of people give them credit for sinking his candidacy. Emily's List, I love that acronym. Early money is like yeast. They are dedicated to raising monies for female candidates across the country. And Act Blue, there's a little story there in that after the passing of Justice Ginsburg, Act Blue broke records for collections of money. In the 9 o'clock hour, they collected, the 9 o'clock hour after the announcement of her passing, they collected $6 million, breaking all their records. 10 o'clock hour, they broke that record. So there is another example of a 527. Now, is it pretty simple? Like a lot of you, I keep score. But is it simple? Is it the one with the most cash that wins? Well, this is what Trump raised in 2016. Not chump change, but he likes to remind people that a lot of money came from little people, small donors. He was outraised dramatically by Hillary Clinton. And Trump will remind you most of her money came from corporate donors, and it would be true. Now, if you want to know specific numbers, and remember, like our last presentation, this is going to be recorded. You can use that link to find out more specifics on how money was raised. And it's interesting, it's from Bloomberg, and maybe you can ask him whether raising lots of money means that you will be successful in a campaign. The projection for this election, 2.2 billion. Now, what's coming up next? The debates. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to show you quickly some charts which graph how candidates' numbers were affected by the debates. And you will see in every case, here's the 92 and 96 elections, that the candidate who started on top stayed on top. So yes, they both got bumps from the debates, but nothing dramatic happened. The challenger did not overtake the incumbent or the favorite, except maybe here. In the 2000 election, yes, Bush's numbers did not at any time surpass Gore's number, but we all know he won the election. That is probably the exception to the rule. But even then, his numbers don't surpass Gore's as a result of the debates. So people say debates aren't really that important. They're not going to be that dramatic. They're not going to change things overnight. If we talk about debate expectations, well, let's hear it in somebody else's words.
Biden can't put two sentences together. They wheel him out, he goes up, he repeats, they ask him questions, he reads a teleprompter, and then he goes back into his basement. You tell me the American people want to have that in an age where we're in trouble with other nations that are looking to do numbers on us.
Okay. So I tell my friends, once Biden walks on stage without aid, and he is able to express his first sentence without aid, then he's won the debate because he's already exceeded the president's expectations. Of course, and that's all tongue in cheek, but here are some considerations that you have to take into mind when you are debating. First of all, what are you going to accomplish? Historically, if you are the favorite or you are an incumbent and you are confident to win, you want to minimize the times you will debate, if at all, because what can you gain by successful performance in a debate? Second of all, how many debates are you going to have? We have 3 debates scheduled this year, beginning late this month. The president and his campaign wanted an additional debate. Their argument was early voting was going to begin before the first debate, and shouldn't we have a debate for those people? The commission said that was not necessary. There were 3 agreed to. There will be no 4th debate. So when they should start is an important consideration, because timing is of the essence, especially if there is, and there always seems to be, some late breaking news which will affect the election, a la Comey's announcement prior to the election of 2016. What should the format be? There are candidates who are more comfortable with, for example, the town meeting format, where you get to field questions directly from people in the audience, and you can be more folksy, and you can represent yourself as a candidate of the people. It's important who is asking the questions. A female moderator in the election of 2016 made news by coming under attack by one of the candidates. This year, it's the gentleman who just saw, Mr. Wallace from Fox News, who's made the news in that perhaps some people think that he's too hard on President Trump and maybe he should not be a moderator. And a moderator himself comes under a lot of pressure for either being too hard or too easy on the candidates. So these are all considerations when you are talking about debates. Here are the dates. By the way, some of the locales have changed because of COVID problems, but these are the final locations. And you can see that the last debate is only a couple of weeks before the election itself. And I thought we'll take a little break here to see some debate moments from the past.
Who am I? Why am I here?
You're simply wrong.
It was true then.
No.
It's true now.
Rick, I'll tell you what. $10,000? $10,000 bet?
I'm not in the betting business,
Oh,
but
okay.
I'll show you this.
I
I'll show you the book.
There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
It took the president 14 days before he called the attack in Benghazi an act of terror.
Get the transfer.
He did in fact, sir. So let me call it an act of terror.
Can you say that a little louder, Candy?
He did call it an act of terror.
We have a question right here.
Yes, how has the national debt personally affected each of your lives? Yes, how has the national debt personally affected?
It's 3 agencies of government when I get there that are gone. Commerce, education, and the, what's the third one there? Let's see. I would do away with the education, commerce, and let's see. I can't. The third one I can't. Sorry. Oops.
But are hesitating on the likability issue, where they seem to like Barack Obama more.
I don't think I'm that bad.
You're likable enough.
Thank you so much.
I appreciate it.
I'm looking forward to finding your facts on that because that just
I'll
doesn't.
tell you what the facts are.
Rick, again.
You had the
Rick,
word.
I'm speaking. I'm speaking.
The
I'm speaking.
newspaper.
I have as much experience in the Congress as Jack Kennedy did when he sought the presidency.
I served with Jack Kennedy. I knew Jack Kennedy. Jack Kennedy was a friend of mine. Senator, you're no Jack Kennedy.
That was really uncalled for, Senator.
What I like about that clip is that if I'm talking to 17-year-olds, I have to do too much explaining. But if I'm talking to an audience like you, you saw all those debates. So next, we're going to talk about 3 things. We're going to talk about polls, we're going to talk about swing states, and we're going to talk about, it escapes me now. But I'll bet you $10,000 I can remember them in a few minutes. And if people didn't catch that, you're trying to downgrade the fact that you are rich, but you are able to spend $10,000 on a bet. I thought that was fascinating. All right, let's talk about polls. I'm going to let this quote stand on its own. And then I'll support it with this video.
Can we still trust polls? After the 2016 US presidential election, a common reaction from across the political spectrum was that polling must be broken. Now that researchers have had time to dig into what happened in 2016 and in polling more generally, we can bring a lot of data to bear on this. Here are the basics. Some people who were surprised by the outcome of the 2016 election still can't get past the feeling that they were led astray by the polls. But the fact of the matter is, the national polls in 2016 were very accurate. On average, the national polls indicated Hillary Clinton would win the popular vote by about 3 percentage points, and she won by 2 points.
When a commission got down to the data, looked at what happened in the 2016 election, they found most of the problems were actually at the state level, where there are folks who are trying to do this kind of polling with not the resources that you might have at the national level. What happened with some of those polls was they were out of the field and missed a late swing among those undecided voters toward Donald Trump. Or another issue they had was underrepresenting people who didn't have college educations. And all of those led to big surprises in the Midwest on election night.
Another common criticism is that pollsters favor a particular political party. But a look at the direction of polling misses in the US over time shows that whether the polls tend to miss in the Republican direction or the Democratic direction is pretty much just a coin flip. Some of the best evidence about the performance of election polling comes from rigorous analyses of the accuracy of polls over time. If anything, national polling in presidential elections is more accurate now than it was a few decades ago. Since 2000, the average absolute error in national presidential polls has been around 2 or 3 percentage points, which historically speaking is really quite good.
An even broader look at polling in 45 countries around the world over the past 75 years, done by Will Jennings and Christopher Walezian, found a similar result. Election polls worldwide have a good record of accuracy, and despite some forecasting misses of the past few years, the average level of accuracy has not declined.
While those overall trends are reassuring, unexpected election outcomes still rattle the public confidence in polls. A good example of this is Brexit. Believe it or not, Brexit was not a massive polling failure. While the betting markets in Britain did strongly suggest that Britons would vote to remain in the European Union, the polls were actually showing a close race. And for most of the final month, the polling showed leave ahead. So while Brexit was certainly not a shining moment in the history of polling, it also wasn't an instance where the polls were wildly off.
Look, the fixation on election polls is totally understandable and probably unavoidable, but they're just not the best barometer for how good a job polling is doing. And that's because election polls have to do something that other polls measuring policies or attitudes don't have to do. They have to figure out, of the people they're talking to on the phone, who is actually going to go out and vote in some day in the future, and then how are they going to vote? And for those of you who have studied human behavior, even if it's just in your friends and family, you know that those kind of predictions are really hard.
While polls may not always be able to call the winner in very close elections, they remain very well equipped for reliably tracking the contours of social attitudes, measuring people's values, their preferences, priorities, and concerns. Take the trend over time in attitudes towards same-sex marriage. This is an example of polling not from an election where real-world events arguably validated the ability of polls to track real movement in public opinion.
You had different polling organizations using different questions to measure support for a legal right for gays and lesbians to marry, but all of them told the same story over time. Majority opposition in the 90s and early 2000s, followed by gradual gains in support through the last decade, and the emergence of majority support in recent years. And these trends were corroborated to some extent by the fact that supporters of same-sex marriage began winning statewide referenda on the issue about the time majority support emerged in the polling.
Another way to evaluate the performance of polls is called benchmarking. We take some questions asked in large federally funded studies with high response rates and ask those same questions in our regular polls. The difference between our poll numbers and the numbers from the benchmark surveys gives us some sense as to our accuracy. We recently benchmarked our telephone surveys against some high-profile federal surveys and found our polls get very similar numbers on issues like what share of Americans identify as Republicans versus Democrats.
And the same goes for what share of Americans identify as Protestant, Catholic, another religion, or no religious affiliation. In these analyses, the fact that the trends from the polls line up very closely with the trends from the benchmark surveys is evidence that the polls remain quite accurate. During the timeline shown, the response rate was declining, but despite what some people claim, the accuracy of these polls basically held steady.
Pew Research Center takes the accuracy of polling very seriously because we believe that polls have a very important role to play in a democracy. They're designed to give every citizen, whether rich or poor, well-educated or less educated, an equal voice. They also serve as a check on politicians on both sides of the aisle who could otherwise just claim to know what the public thinks or why they voted the way they did.
Now, that doesn't mean that people in government should be slaves to poll numbers or that all polls are trustworthy. The polls do perform a valuable function as a reality check on how the public is thinking about major issues and what's going well or going poorly in people's lives.
And even though some recent elections have put a spotlight on the limits to just how accurate polls can be, there is a lot of research showing that well-designed polls still work and still provide useful information. So bottom line, can polls be trusted? As long as we're realistic about the precision that polls can actually provide, yes. Can we still
So, did the polls get it wrong? As was pointed out, not necessarily, because they were just talking about who's going to win the election, the popular vote, and not necessarily the electoral college, which is much more complicated. They predicted a 3-point win, and she won by 2 points. So that is commendable. Where they did screw up is that they did not poll enough people with less formal education. I have a friend who is a conservative. Yes, I have conservative friends. And his point was that the polls are going to get it wrong again because Trump people don't answer their phones and don't answer questions from poll takers. It remains to be seen. Also, there's been a big emphasis in the election of 2020 to make sure that that problem with state polls is taken care of. Because in 2016, we weren't talking about a lot of money. A lot of money has been now expended in those state polls, and people are paying closer attention to them. So, where can polls go wrong? Well, first of all, just what people think about them. They're not supposed to be going to tell you what is going to happen because things change. Sometimes things change overnight. The famous poll I always remember is the Colorado poll for equal rights for gays, in that it was considered to be popular, to be in support of an initiative when asked by poll takers, but when it came for them to actually vote, they changed their minds altogether and the initiative failed. How can you actually achieve randomness? We had a poll taken one time in my classroom, and unbeknownst, I didn't really think too much about it. It happened to be a day where there were a lot of athletes out. It happened to be a day where there were a lot of juniors out of my class. So in trying to be random, I said, I'm not going to pick a specific day. We're just going to have it now. It'll be done at random. It was too random. So true randomness is very hard to achieve. There are so many polls. Which poll do you use as the one indicator? They all have their problems. And if you are asked a push-pull type of question, push-pull is when it's, I guess you would call it a loaded question. For example, are you in support of the Democrats' godless agenda to take the name of the Savior out of schools? Will it be hard for you to say that you are for them? So you're kind of painted into a corner with the way the words are put to that question. Now, it's just asking for what people are thinking at the time. It does not actually equate a vote or a decision in the future. You also have to take a poll with a grain of salt. Who is paying for this poll? Certain polls get reputations, and you have to do your homework sometimes to see who is sponsoring the poll. And there's also a margin of error, plus or minus 1, 2, 3%, which means that if there is a vote, a race where the present numbers are 53 for one candidate and 47 for another, well, that's a difference of 6 points. So it's outside the margin of error. But if they're any closer than that, if the margin of error was three points, for example, give or take 3, then, and it was less than that, then it would be a statistical tie as far as the poll was concerned. My favorite poll, people will ask me, well, my favorite poll is 538. This is a website. It is also a podcast. And the reason I like them is what they do is they will list any number of polls, and they come up with an average of those polls in addition to their own poll. So not only do you see their poll, you see all the other polls as well. And then it's kind of like a mall for polls. It's a one-stop shopping center. It's my favorite. So let's talk about some individual polls, and let's talk about some individual races. First of all, if you're talking about the race in Arizona, I have depicted it in blue because right now it's leaning toward Biden at 4.5 points. Colorado, a purple state, continues to be blue. When I say purple, it means that in the past, the Democrats and Republicans were fighting it and it was in the middle, hence purple, but now people are calling it a blue state. Biden 9.9 points ahead. In a very close race, At this point, Biden by 2. In Iowa, Trump is ahead by 1.7, but that, if you are on the left, is a heartening number because it is close. A close race in a traditionally red state. Now, these are some of the states, the swing states in the Rust Belt, which are important to note because Trump did so much better in 2016 than a traditional Republican had done in the past. Nevada had been, up until the last election, a red state. It is now becoming a blue state. And I'm only mentioning New Hampshire because all of a sudden it has become a tight race. And you say, well, Biden has a 6-point lead on it, but the Democrats traditionally did better. This is a shock. This is a shock in that Biden is now pulling ahead in North Carolina. Ohio maintains itself in the red column. The all-important state of Pennsylvania, Biden's home state. He resides in Delaware, but his history is in Pennsylvania. Virginia. The news out of Virginia this morning was of the people who were demonstrating. We're going to talk about this in the future a little bit, for Trump outside a voting station. Something frowned upon, but Biden has an 11-point lead. Once again, kind of like Iowa, Georgia traditionally has been safe Republican territory. It has become a tight race. So those are the races in the swing states. And as I said before, it's one thing to predict the races for the popular vote or the numbers for the popular vote. It's another to dictate the races in the Electoral College. So let's do some math. First of all, the reason my website is called 538 because that is the total of electoral votes. 100 senators, 435 members of the House for a total of 535. You add 3 from the District of Carolina, you get a total of 538. That is the total number of electoral votes. And you, of course, need 270, the majority, half plus 1, to win. If the race ends with no candidate getting 270 votes, the race is thrown into the House of Representatives. And each state, Rhode Island gets 1 vote, California gets 1 vote. And if you wanted to know, here is the lineup. So if there was a vote tomorrow, it looks like the Republicans would win, even if the tie came to the blue states. But of course, this is a Congress as it stands now, not in January. Because that's what's important, is what results in the November elections is going to determine the Electoral College vote in the future. This map provided to us by NPR gives us a snapshot of how it stands as of September 16th. You might want to look at its site in the future to see what changes are made because it has tightened just slightly. A few weeks ago, it was Biden 270. Right now, it's Biden 268. But Trump also had more numbers than he does now. And you can see the solid blue on the West Coast, which concerns people because it could be that Trump is ahead. It's possible at a certain point. But as time goes on and polls close, then, of course, Biden will pick up momentum on the West Coast. You look at the map and you'll see that it shows at this time, despite the polls, Florida and Georgia, North Carolina as toss-ups. Here's what's changed of late. Virginia and New Mexico The NPR map had them leaning toward the blue side, but now they are calling them likely Democrat. Nebraska has an odd situation where they give one vote for the winner of the total vote and another vote per district for the candidate who is winning in that district. It's a little different, but they're calling Nebraska and Florida as toss-ups in their map. So what happens down the ballot? By that I mean is, okay, perhaps you're in California and you say to yourself, there is no reason for me to go to vote because Biden is going to be a big winner in California. But there's any number of decisions to be made on initiatives and also on other offices as well. That's called the down ballot, other than the presidential race. Let's look at some other math. How about the congressional math? First of all, in the House of Representatives, there are 235 Democrats to 198 Republicans. The Democrats have the advantage. And there's one Libertarian, and there's four vacancies. For example, there's the vacancy in San Diego, a representative who was convicted, and that seat remains open. Everyone runs for re-election in the House because their terms are only 2 years. And there are 9 Democrats leaving. So if their seats are safe, then you'll get 9 Democrats to replace them. But here is, I thought, an interesting number. 3 times as many Republicans who are retiring, which makes them a little more vulnerable unless they're in a safe district. How about the Senate? We're going to be talking about an issue that's very, very topical now in a minute, and these numbers are important. The 2 independents usually vote with the Democrats. A gentleman by the name of Sanders, who, believe it or not, most people don't know, he's not really a Democrat, he's an independent. And Angus King from Maine also usually votes with the Democrats, but it still doesn't give them the majority. But who's up for re-election? In 2018, the Democrats were playing defense. A lot of Democratic senators were up for re-election. The more you have, the more they're vulnerable. But in 2000, it's the other way around. There are 12 Democrats up for re-election and 23 Republicans up for re-election. So you can say there's a lot of targets to bring down if you want to flip the Senate. So here is the scoreboard, and we're talking about the latest polls, subject to change. First of all, in the red state of Arizona, McSally is the incumbent, but she's down by 17 points to the astronaut, Kelly. And most pundits think that is clearly going to be in the Democrats' column. The incumbent, Peters in Michigan, favored to win. In Georgia, the very controversial Kelly Loeffler, is still favored to win, keep her seat, as is the candidate Marshall. Marshall is the one who defeated Kobach, and the Republicans, institutional Republicans, had their fingers crossed that Kobach would not win because he is so controversial. Marshall won, so they think they can retain Kansas. The Democrats are predicted to lose Alabama. Most people say Jones's victory in Alabama was a fluke. The Auburn football coach, Tuberville, is way ahead in the polls. Here is another key state that Democrats are considering to be a very possible win in the state of Colorado. Cory Gardner is down 9 points in Colorado. In Iowa, here's a big surprise. Joni Ernst, Republican in Iowa, is behind in the polls to Greenfield. Another huge surprise. And her name, of course, Collins from Maine, is being tossed around as a result of the latest Supreme Court business. We'll be talking about that in a minute. The governor of Montana is a gentleman by the name of Bullock. He's running a close race with the incumbent, Daines, but Daines is still a point ahead. So remember when I talked about about the plus or minus. That's too close to call. Another surprise in North Carolina, there's been controversy surrounding Tillis, the incumbent. He has fallen 5 points behind the challenger, Cunningham. The incumbent, Perdue, has a tough race with Ossoff, but people figure that he's going to pull it off in Georgia. Here's a huge surprise. And I suppose if you read the internet and you're reading all those requests for donations, they want you to believe that this race is a winnable race. But it's the incumbent, Lindsey Graham, is going to be tough to beat in South Carolina. Anyway, what is the key? The Democrats want to pick up four seats in the Senate. And if they are able to do that, they could take the Senate. Why is this important? Well, it's important for a lot of reasons. Control of the Senate and getting rid of Mitch McConnell as the majority leader. But the passing of Justice Ginsburg makes it even more elemental. Here's a reminder for the scorecard. You need to pick up 4 seats, and I identified those seats which are very vulnerable for the Republicans. Now, of late, these 2 ladies, Senator Collins from Maine and Senator Murkowski from Alaska, have clearly stated that there should not be a confirmation before the election. And there's always the question mark. Senator Romney from Utah, of late, has proven himself to be a maverick. Can he be counted on? Would he be the 3rd vote? In which case, there only would not be need for a 4th vote. Now, in Arizona is an interesting proposition because in Arizona, the incumbent, McSally, who was only placed there to replace Senator McCain to finish out his term. She was appointed by the governor in that state. She, as I told you before, is running against a very popular gentleman, the husband of Gabby Giffords, the representative. Astronaut Kelly, he is a huge favorite to take Arizona from McSally. And what does that mean? Well, it's interesting because this is a special election, very different. Kelly could take office as soon as November 30th. All the other senators have to wait till January 3rd. Now, what does this mean? All that means is the clock has all of a sudden started to beat faster, and there has to be a vote in the Senate prior to November 30th if they want to avoid Kelly's participation. These gentlemen, interestingly enough, if you look at the record, you will find out that every one of them, at one point or another, has said that there should not be a vote in the final year of a president's term, in the election year. Look them up. Probably your favorite is the latest recording of Mr. Graham. And Senator Graham says, use my words against me. And people are cooperating with him. So is there even more drama involved? Yes. Because didn't I say that Senator Gardner is in the race of his life? He's fallen behind in the polls. Will that rescue him or will that sink him even greater? I told you all these people are on record as having said they would not support a hearing for the justice. Here's Mr. Gardner's words. Will he have to live by them? Interesting. A term that's been bandied about in these discussions, the takeover of the Senate, is the nuclear option. You say, well, are you talking about the red phone that the president has in the White Office, in the White House, where he is connected to Putin, the leader of Russia, to preclude any nuclear accident? Well, first of all, that's all fallacy. That's another subject. But no, we're not talking about the nuclear option. In that case, we're talking about something else. You do know that in order to confirm a new justice, you require 60 votes. 60 votes. Well, in order to change things, the nuclear option is a procedure that overrides that. In that no longer do you need 60. In this case, you only ask for a simple majority. A simple majority. And in that case, 51 votes are only going to be needed for major votes. And if the Democrats, for example, are successful in flipping the House, we're talking in the future, not now. We're not talking about the Senate for the rest of the year. I'm talking about in the future, that out of petulance, you may say, out of payback, revenge, whatever word you want to mention, that some people have been saying that the Senate minority, the Democrats, should threaten the majority, the Republicans, by saying that once we take power in the following session, we will enact the nuclear option. And from then on, we will make our confirmations with only a simple majority rather than the 60 votes. Other people say that another option is that you should pack the court. Right now, we have 9 members of the Supreme Court. Who decides how many people should be on the Supreme Court? Well, your answer is Congress. It's been tried before. Roosevelt tried to pack the court. Pack the court just means you increase the number of people on the court. Rather than 9, you could have 13, 11, 15, as many people as you want. And then, of course, that gives the president, the new president, let's say Biden, the opportunity to appoint 5, 6 new justices, thereby guaranteeing a majority for the left. Another controversial point that's been pointed out in the past, the recent past, is the Hatch Act. Here is the Hatch Act. It's a restriction. Now we're talking about federal employees. It restricts their political activity, campaigning, elections, voting, etc., all in the Hatch Act. It was passed in 1939. A quick quiz. You say, well, I don't know anything about the Hatch Act except for what you just mentioned. Well, no, I'm going to ask you ahead of time. From what your understanding of the Hatch Act is, that federal employees are restricted in their use of, for example, the White House in the background, the White House grounds. Can they operate wearing a uniform? Can they operate while they're on the job? So here are the questions. First of all, Melania using the Rose Garden in her address. Is that a violation of the Hatch Act? Mr. Pompeo speaking to us from Israel. Or the president accepting his nomination at the end of the RNC. Are those violations of the Hatch Act? Let's take a closer look. First of all, here's what you may not do. You can't use your office to influence an election. You can't solicit your funds. You can't make a phone call from a federal office asking for cooperation and or monies. And if you are going to do a deal with someone, if Oracle wants to buy TikTok and you have something to say about it, can you solicit future cooperation? Can't do it while you're on duty. Or any office, or wearing a uniform, or even using a government vehicle, facilities. Can't wear a button. Can't have stickers on your desk. People thought it was too stringent, so in 1993 it was updated. but you still couldn't do it while you were working, and you couldn't do it in the workplace at all, even after hours. So how about some answers for your questions? Was Melania in violation? Well, is she a federal employee? Most people would say, no, she's not a federal employee. Pompeo, his argument was, it was after hours. I was not on duty. The president, well, you defend him. But here's the caveat. The Hatch Act does not include the president. So there's his grand defense. The Hatch Act has nothing to do with me. Okay, we found out that the FEC regulates campaign contributions, expenditures. Who enforces the Hatch Act? It's called the Merit Systems Protection Board. Never heard of them, right? It's okay because they exist, but they don't exist. They haven't had any members. Not of late. Who is responsible for appointing members of the Hatch Act or the Merit Systems Protection Board? It's the president. He hasn't done so recently. And by the way, if you're a whistleblower, they're supposed to protect you, but they're asleep at the wheel. No one is manning the board. How about foreign involvement?
We know that Russia tried to meddle in the election.
That is unacceptable, and that is of great concern.
Some of the reasons that the president is so popular is his supporters say he tells it like it is. Well, yes, he does. But sometimes perhaps you wonder whether he should be telling it like it is. As a high school history teacher, I often was brutally frank about some of the mistakes that Americans made overseas in their meddling. And I think that's okay if you're talking about American history, but as the cheerleader for the United States, should you be admitting to American involvement across the world when it comes to elections? Perhaps that's too much transparency. What kind of vulnerabilities do we have when it comes to our infrastructure, our communication, our internet, First of all, our information can be stolen. And when it's stolen, it can be used at inopportune times, as in the case of WikiLeaks. I encourage you to look at that link that I sent you on the local elections from our clerk, Mr. Gong. It'll assure you that there are many fail-safes to protect our infrastructure, but that doesn't mean that foreign powers cannot try to interfere. A troll farm, if you can imagine a giant warehouse with 100 to 200 people all manning computers, and all day long, all they try to do is mess with our social media and or try to find how to break in to our election infrastructure. And oftentimes, I have to laugh because if you don't agree with someone's argument on social media, you can just say, yeah, Ivan, go back and eat your black bread because we don't believe anything you're saying. And sometimes you might be right because there are people in the troll farms who are just trying to plant negative stories in social media. They're also passing along misinformation. There were times where there were rallies. The famous example was where they had a schedule of a red rally and a blue rally in the same time at the same place in a major city, hoping that there would be a clash of forces, and there was. As it turns out, people are trying to figure out where was the source of this organization, and as it turns out, it was set up by bots. There are organizations which really do not exist if you get to the bottom of them. They are created by foreign sources. They sometimes say that no, due to the crowded nature of the November 3rd election, an extra day has been scheduled downtown. Further voting can occur on November 4th. Totally false information. And people have actually fallen for that misinformation. There can be further amplification of, well, I use the example of Trump, but it could be Biden's as well. They say certain things, but they are misinterpreted. All right. We did in the film see about interference. People say, well, why is there some chumminess going on between Trump and Netanyahu? Well, we always have had an interest in what happens in Israel, but people say that there were also loans made to the campaign of Netanyahu in 2016. We worked against the election of Evo Morales in Bolivia in 2002. Boris Yeltsin, that is a very fascinating case. Had it not been for American intervention in 1996, when the Soviet Union was falling apart, then it would have been a short-lived change in hands, and Yeltsin would have been disposed of without our help. Allende was a Marxist leader in Chile, and he was overthrown by, allegedly, the CIA in 1970. And in the 50s and 60s, when we were working with Japan after World War II, had it not been for a great number of actions by the United States, not to be excluding monies, Japan would have looked very differently. We got involved there. And they may not have pointed out directly, but in Iran, Mossadegh was elected in a democratic election, but he was overthrown in favor of a Shah who was more friendly to the United States, and specifically the United States oil industry, in which case the Shah took power, and there's been bad blood in Iran ever since. All right, who's backing who? It depends on who you listen to. Well, the US intelligence, and most of us would trust them, they're saying that Russia is backing Trump. And if you're talking to William Evanina, he says both China and Iran support Biden. So people have made their choices. Donald Trump has his opinion. The last person Russia wants to see in office is Donald Trump. Okay. Now, we want to discuss this because if Biden wins and his vice president candidate, Senator Harris, becomes the vice president, then we are going to need a senator in California, a new senator. How does that happen? Well, I'm going to give you the short story because we're running out of time. The governor of California will be appointing the new senator. There's a precedent. It's happened before. They do it with the House all the time. So who is your future senator? Here's my guesses. The top 8. House Representative Schiff, who achieved notoriety during the impeachment hearings. A state representative, member of the House of Representatives, Ms. Bass. The mayor of Oakland, the very outspoken London Breed. Our Attorney General, Javier Becerra. The Secretary of State, Mr. Padilla. A Silicon House of Representatives member, American Indian, Mr. Khanna. The Senate, the head of the California Senate, Tony Adkins, and another member of the House from LA, Barbara Lee. These are my 8 candidates. One of them will be your next senator from California. You're worried about security at the polls, and I can understand why you would be worried because of?
My question to you then is, are you going to have poll watchers? Are you going to have an ability to monitor to avoid fraud and cross-check whether or not these are registered voters, whether or not there's been identification to know that it's a real vote from a real American?
We're going to have everything. We're going to have sheriffs, and we're going to have law enforcement, and we're going to have hopefully U.S. attorneys, and we're going to have everybody and attorney generals. But it's very...
So, if you didn't catch all that...
My question to you then is...
Are we? Are we? Is he the last word? There is our Homeland Security, which also has a take on the president's charges.
U.S. President Donald Trump's top Homeland Security official said on Sunday that he would not send officers to monitor polling sites during the November election. Chad Wolf, the acting head of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, told CNN he lacked congressional authority to do that. Those comments come despite Trump telling Fox News last week that law enforcement, from sheriffs to U.S. attorneys, would be deployed to polling stations around the country to prevent fraud. Social distancing guidelines have spurred surging interest in alternatives to in-person voting, including early voting, voting by mail, and using ballot drop-off boxes.
This is a very serious problem for a great democracy.
Trump has said repeatedly and without evidence that expanding voters' options will lead to fraud. On Sunday, Twitter slapped a warning over a Trump tweet the social media site said violated its rules to safeguard civic and election integrity.
So, let's look at what poll watchers in California can and cannot do if you're concerned about this. So, essentially, it's a matter of observation. You can stand at a distance. You can talk to the poll workers and supervisors, but you may not talk to the voters. You cannot interfere with the actual process. Can't wear the buttons. Can't wave the flags. No person-to-person contact with voters. And you cannot disperse materials. The argument in Virginia recently had people standing outside the prescribed 40-foot space, but people still felt uncomfortable about it. So we're going to have to see what becomes of that. By the way, Did we not have a case recently in a North County election where someone was caught using a cell phone within 100 feet? That is a violation. All right, let's talk about the conventions. Traditionally, there's been a convention bounce. What that means is that in the polls, after their convention, let's say after the Democratic convention, the Democratic candidate gets a 1, 2, sometimes 4% bounce after that election. But of course, it's going to be followed by the Republican election, and that candidate might get a bounce as well. It depends on what happens during the conventions. It didn't happen this year. It didn't happen this year. Of course, they were very different. They were not like the conventions of the last. And just my personal opinion, I preferred them. I enjoyed them so much more. Well, Trump actually went in reverse. His net average fell after the 2 conventions, whereas Biden's average, we're talking about not are they ahead in the election poll, but in the favorability rating. It's 2 different things. It's favorable rating minus unfavorable rating. And when it came to ayes on the convention, the Democrats outnumbered the Republicans. Now, the problem with the Nielsen's is you're talking about television screens versus streaming. And there's no way to determine the amount of people that watch the convention via stream. But look at this, the only night which the Republicans outnumbered the Democrats was the night that Melania Trump gave her speech, in case you wondered. But on the night when she accepted her nomination, Kamala Harris won. But in the main event, more people actually listened to Joe Biden than did Donald Trump on their final nights, their respective final nights. By the way, the second longest acceptance speech in history after the convention belongs to Donald Trump. Who's the champ? Who has the longest speech in history? Donald Trump, 2016. Okay, we have come almost to the end of our presentation. Thank you for your patience. Bob Anderson, once again, thank you for making sure that technically we're a gem today. Thank you very much for your help. People have always said at the end of an election, the people have spoken. Their voice has been heard. I want to make one final point in my presentation today. Here is the final vote count percentage-wise, the election of 2016. We all know that Clinton got a greater percentage of the vote, popular vote, than did Trump. Now, what's missing from 2020 is that the third party, in this case, the candidates for the third party, Stein and Johnson, aren't really making a lot of noise, and they're not predicted to get very many votes at all. But what's this unshaded, or this shaded part that's unmarked? Well, it's the people who did not vote. 32% of the people, in other words, as many people as voted for Trump did not vote at all. If you want to look at it in numbers, Clinton outpolled Trump by 3 million votes. When you add up Johnson and Stein's vote, and also votes for Mickey Mouse, etc., total of 135 million, well, 136 million people voted. Terrific turnout. In the 2020 election, it's predicted the turnout will be even greater. We're breaking all records. But who did not vote? People who actually registered to vote, but then did not turn up. 64 million people. More registered voters who did not turn up than all those who voted for Trump. And those people who never even bothered to register. So we're talking 112 million Americans did not vote. And consequently, they did not speak. And some people can say they're the people that determined the election of 2016. So let me leave you with that note. Thank you for your patience. Bob Anderson, thank you one more time. Can't thank you enough. We'll see you next Tuesday when we talk about the California propositions. Thank you for your patience.